The dress had taken her mother 3 weeks to finish. Lucy knew every stitch of it, had watched her mother's hands move by candlelight, long after the rest of the village had gone to sleep. Threading ivory silk through a needle no thicker than a pine thorn, it was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever owned, not because it was expensive, it wasn't. The fabric had come from a merchant's remnant pile, slightly uneven at the hem, the embroidery done in thread that caught the firelight and pretended to be gold. But her mother had pressed every seam with her palms and breathed prayers into the collar, and when Lucy had put it on that evening and turned toward the small mirror above the wash basin, she had felt for the first time in her 23 years like someone worth looking at. That feeling had lasted exactly 4 hours. Now she stood at the edge of the grand hall of Velthorn Keep, and the dress felt like a costume she had borrowed from a woman with better luck. The gathering of clans happened once every 5 years. Every pack within 3 mountain ranges sent representatives, alphas, betas, nobles, warriors, and they all converged on Velthorn for 3 days of alliance-making, territorial negotiations, and the ancient ritual of public declarations. Bonds were announced here, mates were claimed. Futures were sealed in front of witnesses who carried the news back to every corner of the known wolf territories. There was no more public place in the world, Lucy knew, and there was no more permanent kind of promise than one made inside these walls. Daniel had promised her 2 months ago. He hadn't whispered it or hedged it with conditions. He had looked her in the eye under the oak tree behind her mother's house, with his hand pressed to her jaw and his scent warm and familiar around her, and he had said, "I will call your name at the gathering. I will stand in front of everyone and choose you." She had believed him. She had no reason not to. They had known each other since childhood. He was the son of her pack's beta, not nobility exactly, but respected. And she was the daughter of a seamstress and a man who had died before she could remember his face. No status, no land, no bloodline worth mentioning. But Daniel had never seemed to care about any of that. She understood now, watching him from across the hall, that she had misread every single moment. He was standing near the dais with his mother and father, his posture straight, his expression composed. He was wearing his formal colors, deep burgundy and gray, the Ashfeld pack sigil stitched across his shoulder. He looked handsome. He also looked like a man who had made a decision, and was not planning to revisit it. The woman beside him was Corrine Voss, daughter of the Voss pack Alpha, with silver blonde hair and a gown that had definitely not come from a remnant pile. She was laughing at something Daniel's mother had said. Her hand rested lightly on Daniel's arm in a way that suggested the touch had become ordinary. Lucy had been standing in this hall for 40 minutes. Daniel had not looked at her once. She pressed her fingers against the seam of her dress, that careful, loving seam, and breathed through her nose the way her mother had taught her to breathe when things became too large to hold. "Count the smells," her mother always said. "When everything falls apart, count what's real." Burning pine resin from the torch brackets, beeswax candles and roasting meat from the feast tables, cold stone beneath the rushes. The layered, complicated scent of 200 wolves in formal clothing, all of them carrying the particular tension of people who wanted things from each other. She counted. She kept counting. When the declaration ceremonies began, she moved closer to the hall's center, because she still, even then, even with Corrine Voss's hand on Daniel's arm, held one small, stubborn coal of hope. People could surprise you. She had seen it happen. Maybe he had simply been speaking with them out of courtesy. Maybe when his name was called and the moment arrived, he would turn and find her in the crowd and say what he had promised. Alpha Gareth of Ashfeld called his son's name near the middle of the ceremony. Daniel walked to the dais. He was calm. He had clearly rehearsed this. He spoke in a clear, carrying voice about alliance and strength and the future of the Ashfeld pack, and then he extended his hand, not toward Lucy, not toward any part of the room where Lucy stood, but toward the place where Corrine Voss waited with a composed, satisfied smile, and he said her name. The hall applauded. Lucy did not move. For a long moment, she was simply not capable of it. The sound of the applause seemed to come from very far away, filtered through water or stone, and the dress with the ivory silk and the careful gold-pretending thread felt suddenly too tight across her chest. Though nothing had changed about the fit, her face was hot. The back of her neck was hot. She was aware, with a clarity that was almost physical, that several people near her had glanced over, just briefly, just enough, because they had known. Some of them had known she was waiting for something that was not going to happen, and they had watched to see what she would do. She would not cry. She decided that with a firmness that surprised her. Not here. Not in front of witnesses who would carry the story home. She was the daughter of a woman who had raised her alone in a village that had never fully respected either of them, and she had inherited, if nothing else, her mother's spine. She turned toward the side door. It was the servants' entrance, less visible than the main arch, and it led to a corridor that ran along the outer wall of the keep toward the eastern courtyard. She knew the path because she had arrived through it. Another small indignity she had simply absorbed, because people of her status did not enter through the front. She moved steadily. She kept her chin level. She did not look back at the dais. She was 3 steps from the door when she walked directly into a wall, except the wall moved and breathed, and caught her by the elbow before she could stumble backward. She looked up. The man was tall enough that she had to adjust her angle considerably to reach his face. He was wearing black, not the formal black of ceremony, but something darker and more functional, like clothing that had a purpose beyond display. No sigil she recognized on his collar. Dark hair, not long but not cut close either, slightly disordered in a way that suggested he hadn't thought about it recently. And his eyes. Gray, she thought at first. But when the nearest torchlight shifted, she revised that to something cooler, less definable, the kind of color that changed depending on what it was looking at. He was not alone. To his left stood a man who was almost laughing, broad-shouldered, copper-haired, with the kind of face that seemed constitutionally incapable of taking anything seriously. He was watching the interaction with visible delight. To his right stood someone leaner, darker, with a long scar along his jaw and an expression of detached assessment that made Lucy feel briefly like a document being read. The tall man in black had not released her elbow. "You're leaving," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low, not quiet exactly, but contained, the way a fire is contained when it doesn't need to prove anything. "Yes," Lucy said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. "The ceremonies aren't finished. Mine is." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She would have stepped away immediately from pity. It was more like recognition, though that made no sense, because she had never seen this man before in her life, and she was quite certain she would have remembered. The copper-haired man to his left made a small sound that was definitely suppressed laughter. The scarred man said nothing, but his eyes moved from Lucy to the dais and back with the efficiency of someone cataloging information. The tall man finally released her elbow, but he didn't step aside. "One question," he said. Lucy looked at him steadily. The coal of hope that had burned for Daniel was gone. She could feel the absence of it, clean and cold in her chest, but something else had taken its place. Something she didn't have a name for yet. Wariness, perhaps. Or the particular alertness that came from being in the presence of something that hadn't declared its nature. "Who are you?" she asked. The copper-haired man stopped pretending not to laugh. The scarred man's eyes did something that might, on a less controlled face, have been a smile. And the tall man in black looked at her for a moment with that shifting gray gaze, before he said quietly, as though it were the least important fact in the room, "Caius, king of the northern throne." The side door was still 3 steps away. Lucy did not move toward it. The name landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Caius, king of the northern throne. She had heard the name, of course. Everyone had. The northern throne was not a pack in the conventional sense. It was the seat above packs, the authority that all alpha lines ultimately answered to when territories collapsed into war or ancient law required a final voice. The king of the northern throne did not attend gatherings as a representative. He attended as the reason everyone else behaved themselves. Lucy had simply not expected him to be standing in a servant's corridor catching women who walked into him. She became aware, in the space of a single breath, of several things simultaneously. The first was that she had just told the most powerful wolf in the known territories that her ceremony was finished, in a tone that had not been particularly respectful. The second was that the dress her mother had spent 3 weeks making was now the garment she was wearing when she met him. The third, and most disorienting, was that he was still looking at her. Not past her, not through her, not with the glazed courtesy that powerful men usually aimed at women of no status. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a word they cannot immediately translate. You didn't know who I was, he said. No, Lucy admitted. There was no point in pretending otherwise. You walked into me and told me your ceremony was finished. I did. The copper-haired man. She was beginning to suspect he was constitutionally incapable of silence. Exhaled a breath that was entirely laughter wearing a thin disguise. I like her, he announced, to no one in particular. You like everyone, Emmerich, the scarred man said, without inflection. I like interesting people, Emmerich corrected. There's a difference. Caius had not looked away from Lucy. It was beginning to feel less like scrutiny and more like something she didn't have precise language for, a kind of focused stillness, like a predator that has decided it is not hungry, but has not yet decided to move on. What is your name? He asked. Lucy. Pack? She kept her voice even. Ashfeld. Something moved through the air between them. Not from her, but from him. A slight shift in the quality of his attention. A fractional tightening around his eyes. He knew then. He had likely been present for the declaration ceremonies, or close enough to understand what Ashfeld meant in this context, on this particular evening. Spoken by a woman in an ivory dress walking toward the servants' exit. He did not comment on it. She was grateful for that in a way she hadn't expected to be. Walk with me, he said. It was not quite a command. It was also not quite a request. It occupied some third space that Lucy suspected he used often. The register of a man accustomed to being agreed with, who had learned that phrasing the agreement as an invitation made it marginally more civilized. Why? She asked. Emmerich made a sound like a man who had just won a private wager. Caius tilted his head slightly. Because the eastern courtyard is quieter than this corridor, and you look like someone who needs air. It was such a plain, practical answer that it disarmed her. She had been braced for something else, a reason that required something from her. A statement of interest that would ask her to perform gratitude or surprise or flattery. Instead, he had simply observed a true thing and offered a reasonable solution to it, and she found, standing in the torchlit corridor with the sounds of applause still drifting through the wall behind her, that she was too tired to construct an objection. She walked with him. The eastern courtyard was indeed quieter. It was a wide, flagged space enclosed on 3 sides by the keep's outer walls, the 4th opening to a view of the valley below Velthorn. Dark forest and distant peaks under a sky that had not yet decided whether to clear or storm. Someone had placed iron braziers along the perimeter, and they burned low and orange, scenting the air with pine resin and char. The stone benches along the walls were empty. Whatever politics were happening inside the grand hall had kept everyone sufficiently occupied that no one had wandered out here yet. Lucy stopped near the wall's edge and looked at the valley. The cold air was a relief against her face. She breathed it in and let it sit in her lungs for a moment, grounding, real. Behind her, she could hear the 3 men arrange themselves with a casualness that was not entirely casual. Emmerich somewhere to her left, likely sitting on something he shouldn't. The scarred man whose name she still didn't know somewhere closer to the doorway, and Caius a few feet to her right, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to leave her room. You're not going to pretend that wasn't what it looked like, Caius said. No, Lucy said. I'm not. Good. A pause. Pretending is exhausting, and I don't have patience for it tonight. She glanced sideways at him, in the open air, away from the torch press of the corridor. He looked slightly different, less monolithic, more specific. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was older than she had first assumed. His jaw carried a day or 2 of dark shadow. He was standing with his arms loose at his sides, his weight slightly back, and there was something about the posture that struck her as genuine rather than performed, as though in the absence of an audience that required something from him, he had simply stopped requiring anything from himself. Why are you out here? She asked. I told you, you needed air. You didn't need to come with me for that. He looked at the valley. No, he agreed. I didn't. The answer sat between them, incomplete, and apparently comfortable with being incomplete. Lucy turned it over in her mind and decided not to press it. She had enough to manage without also trying to decode the motivations of the Northern King. Emmerich appeared at her left elbow with the abruptness of someone who had been waiting for a silence long enough to interrupt. He hasn't left a gathering ceremony early in 6 years, he offered, in a tone of helpful information. Just so you have context, Emmerich, Caius said. I'm providing background, Emmerich said. It's useful, it's unwanted. Those aren't the same thing. Emmerich smiled at Lucy with the specific warmth of a man who had decided to be her ally for reasons she hadn't agreed to yet. He had the copper hair and the broad shoulders and the laugh-ready face. But up close she could see the calluses on his hands and the particular way he held himself that said soldier underneath the charm. I'm Emmerich, his cousin. Unfortunately for both of us, the quiet one by the door is Soren. He doesn't talk much, but he notices everything. So I'd be accurate around him if I were you. I'm always accurate, Lucy said. Emmerich looked delighted. See? He said, turning to Caius. This is what I mean. Caius was watching her again with that translating expression. Lucy held it for a moment, and then looked back at the valley, because looking at him for too long felt like standing too close to one of the braziers. Not painful exactly, but something she needed to manage carefully. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Why did you stop me in the corridor? The answer did not come immediately. She appreciated that. It meant he was giving it real consideration rather than reaching for whatever sounded best. The valley below was very dark, the forest indistinguishable from the sky at the edges, and the wind coming up from it carried the smell of wet earth and pine and the distant cold suggestion of snow on the peaks. Your scent, he said finally. Lucy turned to look at him. I noticed it when you entered the hall, he continued, as though this were a straightforward piece of information rather than something that landed with considerable weight. It's not common. I've been to 47 gatherings. I've never encountered it before. My scent, she repeated. It's not an insult, Emmerich offered from her left. He means it as, I know what he means, Lucy said quietly. In the wolf world, scent was not a small thing. It was identity and bloodline and truth, more reliable than words or sigils or the declarations made in grand halls. Alphas could read it the way scholars read text. Not perfectly, not always, but with a depth of comprehension that went beyond the ordinary. For a king-level alpha to say he had never encountered a scent like hers before was either flattery or something considerably more significant. She didn't know which it was. She wasn't sure he did either. I'm the daughter of a seamstress, she said. My father is dead. I have no bloodline worth mentioning and no status in any pack record. Whatever you think you found, you may have the wrong person. Caius looked at her steadily. I may, he said, but I don't think so. From near the doorway, Soren's quiet voice came for the first time since the corridor. Your mother's name, he said. It was not quite a question. Lucy turned. The scarred man was watching her with that document-reading expression, his arms crossed, his posture contained. There was nothing threatening in it, but there was something deliberate. Maren, Lucy said. Why? Soren looked at Caius. Something passed between them that she couldn't read. Quick and wordless and apparently conclusive. Caius did not explain it. He looked back at the valley and was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become intentional. Then he said, without preamble, without the softening she might have expected, I need to return to the Northern Throne in 2 days. Court law requires that I arrive with a declared mate, or face a council challenge I've been postponing for 3 years. A pause. I need a wife by tomorrow. Lucy stared at him. The wind moved across the courtyard. One of the braziers popped and resettled. And you're telling me this, she said slowly, because I'd like it to be you. The valley below was very dark and very quiet. Somewhere inside the keep, the declaration ceremonies were continuing. Daniel was probably standing beside Corrine Voss with his hand in hers, and her mother's dress was standing in an eastern courtyard in the cold, and the king of the Northern Throne had just asked her to be his wife. Lucy looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked the only question that felt true enough to say out loud, quietly, without pretense, in the voice of someone who has already lost enough tonight to have nothing left to protect. Do you actually see me? She whispered. Or do you only need someone to fill a throne? The question stayed in the air between them. Lucy had not meant to say it quite like that. So bare, so direct, without any of the protective layers she normally kept in place when speaking to people who had power over her circumstances. But the evening had stripped something from her. the way cold strips warmth gradually and then all at once, and what remained was simply what was true. She was tired of performing composure for an audience that wasn't watching. She was tired of being careful. Caius did not answer immediately. He turned from the valley and looked at her fully, with the kind of attention that had nothing performative in it. No calculation of how the answer would land, no adjustment for effect. He simply looked at her the way someone looks at a question they have been waiting to be asked, and the waiting had been long enough that the answer had settled into something certain. "I have spoken to 300 women in formal contexts in the last 2 years," he said. "My counsel arranged introductions. My cousin arranged introductions." A glance toward Emmerich that carried the specific exhaustion of someone who has been managed by well-meaning people for too long. Every one of those women knew who I was before they entered the room. Every conversation started with that knowledge already inside it, shaping everything. What they said, how they held their faces, what they decided I wanted to hear. He paused. "You walked into me in a corridor and told me your ceremony was finished. You didn't know my name. When I told you, you didn't change." Lucy held his gaze. "I was too tired to change. I know." Something in his expression shifted. Not softer exactly, but more open. The way a window is more open than a wall, even when the temperature outside is uncertain. That's the first honest thing anyone has said to me at a gathering in longer than I can accurately remember. Behind her, Emmerich was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, the silence of someone exercising genuine restraint. Soren had not moved from the doorway, but his attention had shifted outward toward the courtyard's entrance, giving them a privacy that was functional, if not literal. Lucy looked down at her hands. The knuckles were slightly white from the cold. She uncurled her fingers and let the night air move across her palms, and tried to think clearly about what was being offered and what it would cost, and whether those two things were anywhere near each other. "You said your counsel would challenge you," she said, "if you arrive without a mate." "Yes." "Tell me what that means." He did not seem surprised by the question. If anything, he seemed to find it appropriate, which told her something. "The Northern Throne passes through strength and through law in equal measure. I have held it for 9 years without a declared mate, which my council has tolerated because the territorial negotiations have required full attention, and personal alliances were a distraction. That patience has a limit. There are 3 council members who believe an unmated king is an unstable king, and they have spent the last 18 months building a case for a formal challenge, a ritual contest that would require me to either declare or defend the throne by combat." "Could you win the combat?" Emmerich made a small sound. "Yes," Caius said, without arrogance, simply as a fact. "But a king who holds his throne through combat, every generation teaches his people that the throne is held by force. I prefer it to be held by law. A declared mate resolves the council's objection within their own framework and removes the justification for the challenge entirely." Lucy was quiet for a moment. The logic was clean. She could follow it without difficulty, and she appreciated that he had presented it plainly rather than dressing it up in flattery or obscuring the practical dimensions beneath romantic language. He needed a wife by tomorrow. He was telling her exactly why and exactly what it meant, without pretending it was something other than what it was. And yet, "You said it was my scent," she said. And then Soren asked about my mother. The shift in Caius's attention was subtle but present. He glanced once toward Soren, who gave a minimal nod that apparently constituted permission. "Maren of the Valley Settlements," Soren said from the doorway, his voice quiet and precise. "Formerly Maren Ashvale, before she left the Eastern Territories 24 years ago." Lucy's breath stopped. She knew her mother's maiden name. She had known it her whole life, but she had never heard it spoken by someone outside her immediate family, because her mother did not speak of it, had not spoken of it, not once, in any context that invited questions. The name existed in Lucy's knowledge the way a locked room exists in a house. Present, acknowledged, never entered. "Ashvale," she repeated. "An old name," Soren said. "Old enough that most current pack records don't carry it. The Ashvale line was a bloodline of the pre-consolidation era, before the Northern Throne formalized territorial law. They were what older records call founding stock." He paused. "Alpha origin lineage, unmixed." The courtyard was very still. Lucy heard the words and felt them rearrange something structural inside her understanding of herself. Not dramatically, not with the force of revelation that stories usually described, but quietly, the way furniture rearranges a room. The same walls, different shape. My mother never told me, she said. She left, Soren said, without judgment. People who leave usually leave everything, including the name. Caius was watching her with that still, gray attention. It explains the scent, he said. Founding stock carries a specific marker. It doesn't dilute the way mixed lines do. It's rare because most of those bloodlines were absorbed into pack structures during consolidation, and the records were either lost or deliberately obscured. A pause. You've spent your life in Ashfeld as a seamstress's daughter with no bloodline worth mentioning. You are, by any pre-consolidation measure, higher born than everyone in that hall tonight. Lucy looked at him. She thought about the dress, about her mother's hands moving by candlelight. 3 weeks of careful work, gold pretending thread. She thought about the village, and the way people had always looked slightly past her, slightly through her, the specific texture of being considered unremarkable. She thought about Daniel saying, "I will call your name under the oak tree," and meaning it. She was almost certain he had meant it, right up until the moment that meaning it had required something from him. She did not feel triumphant. She felt strangely, like she wanted to go home and sit with her mother and ask every question she had never asked. And she understood for the first time that some of those questions might have answers that changed the shape of everything she thought she knew. "This doesn't obligate me," she said finally. "No," Caius agreed. "It doesn't. You're telling me because you think I deserve to know, not because you're using it as leverage." "If I wanted to use it as leverage, I would have led with it." His tone was dry but not unkind. "I led with a courtyard and cold air because you looked like someone who needed both before she could hear anything else." Emmerich, from somewhere behind her, said quietly, "He's telling the truth, for reference." "I know," Lucy said. She wasn't certain how she knew, but she did, the same way she had known, watching Daniel across the grand hall, that the coal of hope had finally gone out. Some things could be felt accurately without evidence. She turned to face the valley again. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the full cold weight of the mountain forest, and it moved through the courtyard with the smell of earth and pine and distance. She thought about what her life looked like from the outside, the dress, the rejection, the servant's exit. And then she thought about what it might look like from some other vantage point, and whether those two pictures had anything to do with each other. "If I said yes," she said slowly, without looking at him, "what would it mean, practically?" "Tonight, a formal declaration before witnesses. Myself, Emmerich, Soren, and whoever you choose from your own acquaintance. Tomorrow, the gathering's record keeper registers the bond. The day after, we travel north, to the Northern Throne. Yes. And then? And then you are the declared mate of the Northern King, which means you have the legal protections of that position, the resources of the throne, and the political standing to do whatever you choose to do with it." He paused. "I won't pretend it is a small life. It isn't. But I also won't pretend I can promise you more than honesty about what it involves." Lucy was quiet for a long time. Somewhere inside the keep, a horn sounded, the signal for the feast to begin. She heard the distant sound of movement, voices, the scrape of benches, the particular percussion of a large gathering transitioning from ceremony to celebration. In there, Daniel was sitting beside Corrine Voss. In here, the king of the Northern Throne was waiting for an answer she had not given yet. She thought about her mother's hands. She thought about Soren saying founding stock in that quiet, precise voice, and the way the locked room in her understanding of herself had opened just enough to let in light. She thought about the question she had whispered, "Do you actually see me?" And the answer he had given, which had not been beautiful or elaborate or designed to convince her, which had simply been the truth arranged in plain language and left there for her to evaluate on its own merits. She turned to face him. "I have one condition," she said. Caius waited. "My mother comes north with me. She is not left behind." Something moved through his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite the absence of it, something in between, like a man recalibrating a distance he had slightly misjudged. "Done," he said. Lucy held his gaze for another moment. The braziers burned low and orange around the courtyard walls, and the valley below was dark with forest, and the world she had woken up in that morning was no longer the world she was standing in. and she was not sure yet whether that was catastrophe or grace. "Then yes," she said quietly. "By tomorrow." The declaration was made before midnight. Emmerich found a candle and held it with the solemnity of a man who found the entire situation privately wonderful, but understood that the moment required him to behave. Soren produced a length of dark cord from somewhere inside his coat. Lucy did not ask why he was carrying it, but filed the fact away as confirmation that he was a man who anticipated things. And the old binding ritual was performed in the eastern courtyard with the valley as witness, and the brazier smoke rising in slow columns around them. Lucy had sent word inside for Petra. Petra arrived in approximately 4 minutes, which meant she had either been looking for Lucy already, or had developed a supernatural sense for moments that required her presence. She was small and dark-haired, and had been Lucy's closest friend since they were girls, the daughter of Ashfeld's blacksmith. Practical in the way that people who grew up around fire and metal tended to be practical. She came through the courtyard door, read the situation in a single sweep. Caius, Emmerich, Soren, the cord, Lucy's expression, and said, with admirable composure, "All right. What do I need to do?" "Witness," Lucy told her. Petra looked at Caius for a long moment, with the frank assessment of someone who did not adjust their standards for rank. Then she looked back at Lucy. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." Petra nodded once, the way a blacksmith's daughter nods when she has evaluated the structural integrity of something and found it acceptable. She took her place beside Lucy without further comment. The ritual itself was brief. Caius spoke the formal words in the old tongue. Lucy knew enough of it to follow, had learned it as a child from her mother in the evenings, another piece of a history she now understood differently. He bound the cord once around their joined wrists and said the declaration in the language that pre-consolidation law required for it to be unbreakable. Lucy repeated the answering words. The cord was removed and divided, half kept by each, in the traditional form. When it was done, Emmerich exhaled a breath that sounded genuinely relieved. "Good," he said with feeling. "Excellent. 3 years of council correspondence resolved in one evening. I'm getting wine." "Emmerich," Soren said. "I'm getting wine for everyone," Emmerich amended, and disappeared back inside. In the silence that followed, Caius looked at the piece of dark cord in his hand. He did not make a ceremony of it. He folded it carefully and put it in his coat, with the same matter-of-fact precision Soren had used to produce it. And Lucy thought that this small, undemonstrative gesture told her more about him than the declaration itself had. Petra appeared at her side. Her voice was very low. "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet," Lucy said honestly. Petra took her hand and held it for a moment. "Your mother is going to have a great deal to say." "I know. She's going to say it all at once, probably." "I know that too." Petra's grip tightened briefly and then released. "Then you're as ready as you can be." She looked once more at Caius, who had moved a few feet away and was speaking quietly with Soren, giving them space with the same deliberate consideration he had shown in the corridor, and said under her breath, "He has good manners, at least, for a king." Lucy almost smiled. It was the first time all evening that smiling had felt like a natural possibility rather than an effort. She told her mother that night. Maren was staying in the lower guest quarters assigned to Ashfeld's attending members, a small stone room with a narrow window and a bed that was better than what they had at home. She was awake when Lucy arrived. Had been awake, Lucy suspected, since the moment the declaration ceremonies began, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged in the particular expression of a woman who is preparing herself for several possible outcomes simultaneously. Lucy sat beside her on the bed and said it plainly, the way Caius had been plain with her, because she had learned something tonight about the value of directness from someone who practiced it without apology. She told her about the corridor, about the courtyard, about Soren saying Ashvale in that quiet, precise voice. Her mother's face, through all of it, was very still. When Lucy finished, the silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. "You knew," Lucy said. Not an accusation, a recognition. Maren looked at her hands. They were seamstress's hands, marked by needles and thread, and the particular roughness of work done consistently over many years. "I knew what the name meant," she said finally. "I also knew what it cost. The old bloodlines attracted attention, Lucy. Not always the kind that protected you. When your father died and I was alone with you, I made a choice." She paused. "I chose invisible over valuable. because invisible was safer. You could have told me. I could have. Her mother looked up. Her eyes were steady, the way they were always steady. Maren had not survived alone by being a woman who collapsed under weight. Would you have believed it? A seamstress's daughter with founding stock blood? In a village where we couldn't afford good candles half the winter? Lucy thought about it honestly. No, she admitted. Probably not. Her mother nodded. Then she looked at the piece of dark cord in Lucy's hand. She had kept her half, folded twice, small and plain, and her expression changed in a way that Lucy could not entirely read. Something between relief and grief, and the particular feeling of watching a thing you protected for a long time finally step out from under the cover of your protection. He sees you, Maren said. It was not a question. I asked him that, Lucy said. He answered honestly. Her mother was quiet for another moment. Then, I'll need to pack. Lucy breathed out. I told him you were coming. He agreed. Maren looked at her for a long moment, long enough to complete some internal evaluation that Lucy was not privy to, and then reached out and pressed her palm against Lucy's face, the way she had done when Lucy was a child, and had come home from something difficult. Her hand was warm and slightly rough and entirely familiar. All right, she said, then we go north. The morning brought complications, as mornings tended to do. Daniel found her in the corridor outside the guest quarters before the keep had fully woken, in that gray early hour when the torches had burned low and the stone floors held the cold of the night before. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was satisfying in a way Lucy was not entirely proud of, but did not attempt to suppress. I heard, he said. His voice was controlled but strained at the edges. Then you don't need me to explain anything, Lucy said. She was carrying her mother's traveling bag and her own, which were not heavy. They had not brought much, not expecting to leave with more than they arrived with. Lucy. He stepped slightly into her path. Not blocking it, he had the self-awareness to stop short of that, but present enough to require acknowledgement. I want you to understand that what happened last night with Kareen was not... It was a decision made under pressure. My family... I know, Lucy said. He blinked. He had been prepared, she could see, for anger or tears or the extended confrontation that would have allowed him to explain himself into a more favorable position. He was not prepared for I know, delivered without heat. Then you understand. I understand that you made a choice under pressure and it wasn't me. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. I made a choice last night too. It also wasn't you. A pause. I hope you and Kareen are genuinely well-suited. I mean that without irony. She stepped around him and continued down the corridor. He did not follow, which she respected. Caius was in the main courtyard with Emmerich and Soren when she arrived, their horses already prepared. The traveling party assembled with an efficiency that suggested it had been organized while most of the keep was still asleep. He saw her cross the courtyard with her mother beside her, and something in his posture changed in a way that was not dramatic, just a slight orientation, like a compass needle completing a movement it had been in the middle of. He looked at Maren with genuine attention. You are Maren Ashvile. Her mother met his gaze with the composure of a woman who had spent 24 years being invisible, and was apparently prepared, without much transition time, to be seen. I am, she said. Your daughter has your bearing, Caius said. It was a plain observation, not a compliment designed to flatter, and Maren received it as such with a minimal nod that Lucy recognized as approval. Emmerich appeared at Maren's other side, with the specific energy of a man adopting someone. I'm Emmerich. I'll be making sure the journey north is not too grim. It's a 3-day ride, and Soren counts as grim enough for all of us. From several feet away, Soren said, without looking up from the map he was examining. I heard that. Intended, Emmerich said cheerfully. Lucy settled her bag across her horse and looked north, the direction she could not see from here, blocked by the keep's walls and the mountain ridges beyond, but present in the imagination as a direction, a destination, a life that had not existed yesterday morning. She felt Caius move to stand beside her. He did not speak immediately, which she had already learned was characteristic. He did not fill silences out of discomfort. He let them exist until there was something worth putting into them. The council will want to meet you quickly, he said finally. They'll have questions. What kind of questions? The kind that are really statements, he said, dressed as questions to give themselves the appearance of open minds. Lucy considered this. I've handled that kind of question before. He glanced at her sideways. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you rather than warning you. There was a difference, and she understood it immediately. Telling her was respect. Warning her would have been doubt. She filed that away alongside the folded cord and the plain answer in the courtyard and the way he had spoken to her mother just now, and she thought that the picture assembling itself was not a complete one yet, not by a significant distance, but the pieces she had so far were all pointing in the same direction. She put her foot in the stirrup and mounted. Then let's not keep them waiting, she said. The northern throne was older than its name suggested. Lucy had expected grandeur, had prepared herself, during the 3 days of riding through mountain passes and dense pine forest, for something imposing and cold, all sharp architecture and deliberate intimidation. What she found instead was a fortress that had grown over centuries, rather than been designed in a single vision, layer upon layer of stone, added by different hands in different eras, so that the whole structure had the organic quality of something alive rather than built. The walls were dark granite, smoothed by weather. The towers were uneven in height. Moss had claimed the lower courses of the northern face, and the gate arch was carved with markings so old that no current record fully explained them. It felt, unexpectedly, like a place that had been waiting. The council received her the morning after their arrival, in the long chamber that served as the throne's formal meeting hall. There were 7 of them, 5 men and 2 women, all alpha rank, all carrying the particular density of people who had held authority for long enough that it had become structural rather than performed. They sat along one side of a heavy oak table and looked at her with expressions that ranged from careful neutrality to barely concealed skepticism. Caius sat at the head of the table. He had not briefed her extensively on what to say, which she had initially found slightly alarming, and then recognized as the same thing he had done in the courtyard. He was not managing her, he was trusting her, and those were not the same thing at all. The council member who had been building the challenge case, a broad, gray-templed alpha named Aldrich, who carried his skepticism with the confidence of a man who had prepared it for an audience, spoke first. The declaration was made in haste, he said, not a question. It was made in one evening, Lucy said. Whether that constitutes haste depends on what you think the relevant factors are. Aldrich's eyes narrowed slightly. You are from Ashfeld, a minor pack. No recorded bloodline. Unrecorded, Lucy said. There's a difference. Beside Aldrich, one of the women, sharp-faced, silver-haired, with the eyes of someone who had been underestimated by enough people to find it useful, tilted her head with an expression of reassessment. Her name was Councillor Vielle, and she had said nothing yet, only watched. Soren, standing along the wall behind Lucy, spoke without being addressed. The Ashvale lineage documentation has been located in the pre-consolidation archive. I have placed copies before each council member's seat. There was a pause while 7 sets of eyes moved to the documents in front of them. The pause extended. Aldrich's expression shifted through several phases, none of them comfortable. Ashvale, Vielle said quietly. It was the same tone Soren had used in the courtyard at Velthorn. Recognition. Recalibration. Founding stock, Soren confirmed. Unmixed. Pre-consolidation record. The lineage is intact through the maternal line. Aldrich looked up from the document. The architecture of his skepticism had not entirely collapsed, but several of its load-bearing elements were visibly compromised. This does not address the speed of the declaration, he said, with the determination of a man who had not yet found a graceful retreat. The speed of the declaration, Caius said, speaking for the first time since the session had begun, in a tone so measured it functioned almost as silence, is my business. The validity of it is yours. You have the bloodline documentation. You have the witnesses. You have the record. He let a moment pass. Is there a legal objection, Aldrich? Or a personal one? The silence that followed was the kind that settled questions. Aldrich looked at the document once more, then he set it down, with the careful precision of a man who is conceding something and choosing to do it with dignity. No legal objection, he said. Vielle looked at Lucy directly. You'll find this council easier to work with once it's accepted that you're not going anywhere, she said. It was not quite warmth, but it was the absence of hostility, which in a council chamber functioned as near enough. Welcome to the Northern Throne. The weeks that followed were not simple. Lucy had not expected simple. She had arrived at a place that had its own history, and its own weight, and its own way of doing things, and she was a new presence inside it, which meant that every interaction carried the low-level friction of mutual adjustment. There were staff who were uncertain how to address her. There were territorial representatives who arrived for meetings and spent the first 10 minutes deciding what to make of her before settling into something approximating respect. There was a great deal of administrative language to learn, an old law to read, and the geography of the fortress itself to master, which was genuinely complex, given its layered origins. Her mother settled into the East Wing with the pragmatic adaptability of a woman who had already made one large life change and knew the mechanics of it. She found the fortress's workroom within the first week, and had introduced herself to the household seamstress within the second, and by the end of the first month there was a working partnership between them that had redesigned 3 sets of formal hangings and showed no signs of stopping. Marin was, Lucy reflected, profoundly difficult to diminish regardless of context. Emmerich was a consistent and largely welcome presence. He arrived at meals with the reliability of someone who had decided that Lucy's company was worth prioritizing and made no secret of it, and his particular gift for dissolving tension with well-placed humor was something the throne's atmosphere benefited from considerably. Soren remained quiet and observant, and occasionally said things that reoriented entire conversations with the efficiency of a blade, and Caius. Caius was careful with her in a way that she gradually understood was not distance, but deliberateness. He was present, at meals, at the council sessions she attended, in the evenings when the fortress had quieted, and they sat in the study with the fire and whatever documents required attention. He spoke to her as he had in the courtyard at Velthorn, plainly, without management, with a consistent underlying assumption that she was capable of handling true things. He asked her opinion, and then actually listened to the answer, which was rarer than it should have been, and which she noticed every time. But he waited. She understood, as weeks became a month, and the month began to move toward 2, that he was not performing patience. He genuinely had it, the way a deep river has depth, not as an effort, but as a nature. He had made the declaration, he had brought her north, and now he was allowing the reality of the situation to develop at whatever pace was honest. Because forcing a pace would have been a different kind of use than the one she had asked him about in the courtyard, but a use nonetheless. She loved him for that before she understood she loved him. The understanding came on an ordinary evening in the 6th week during a council meeting that had run long and grown contentious over a border dispute between 2 eastern packs. Aldrich had been pressing a solution that would benefit one pack disproportionately, and Lucy, who had read the relevant land records that morning because she read everything relevant and had developed an opinion, had said so, clearly, with the documentation to support it. The room had shifted. Caius had said nothing during her argument, had simply watched with that gray attention, and afterward, when the session was done and they were walking back through the stone corridor, he had said, quietly, without preamble, "You were right. And Aldrich knows it. He didn't concede," she said. "He will," Caius said. "He needs a week to arrive at positions he didn't originate. It's a pattern." A pause. "You'll learn them all. The patterns." She had looked at him in the corridor light and thought, "I already know yours." And then she had thought about what it meant that she knew his patterns after 6 weeks when she had spent years not knowing Daniel's after a lifetime. And the answer to that question had been quiet and certain and entirely without drama. She had reached out and taken his hand. He had gone very still for a moment, the stillness of something unexpected arriving in a place that had been carefully prepared for it, but had still, when it came, required a breath. Then his fingers had closed around hers with the same matter-of-fact deliberateness he brought to everything, and they had walked the rest of the corridor in silence that was not empty, but full. 3 months after the gathering at Velthorn, Petra arrived at the Northern Throne. She came with a letter and a traveling pack, and the expression of someone who had made a practical decision and was not interested in discussing whether it had been sentimental. The letter was from Ashfeld's Beta, formally releasing her from pack membership, which she had requested herself. She handed it to Lucy in the entrance hall and said, "I decided I'd rather be useful somewhere interesting than comfortable somewhere I already know everything about." Lucy embraced her. Petra endured this briefly and then said in Lucy's ear, "Also, Emmerich sent a message inviting me to visit and described the fortress library as unreasonably large, which I took as a personal challenge. He sent you a message. He's been sending messages for 6 weeks. I eventually ran out of reasons to ignore them. Petra pulled back and looked at Lucy with frank assessment. You look well. I am well, Lucy said, and meant it. In the early spring, when the snow on the mountain passes had softened enough to allow travel, a delegation arrived from Ashfeld on routine territorial business. Daniel was among them, not leading, but present, a secondary figure in his father's official party. He saw Lucy across the reception hall where the delegation was formally received, and whatever he had expected, whatever version of her he had been carrying in his memory since Velthorn, it was clearly not what was standing in front of him. She was wearing deep blue, the throne's formal color, with her hair up in a way that Maren had spent considerable time designing. She was standing beside Caius, not behind him, not decoratively alongside him, but genuinely beside him, in the spatial language of people who occupy the same ground. She met Daniel's eyes across the room without difficulty. No coal, no residue of hope or grief, or the particular exhaustion of caring about something that had refused to hold its shape. Just a clean, unencumbered acknowledgement that he had existed, that she had known him, that this was where the story of that acquaintance ended. He looked away first. The confirmation came in late spring, in the way of such things, quietly, privately, between Lucy and her mother in the East Wing workroom, among bolts of fabric and the smell of thread and beeswax and the familiar sound of Maren's hands doing what Maren's hands had always done. When Lucy told her, Maren set down her needle with great care, as a person sets down something precious, and looked at her daughter for a long moment with an expression that contained everything she had ever hoped for and more than she had ever allowed herself to expect. Then she picked the needle back up and said practically, "We'll need to adjust the blue gown." Lucy sat down beside her and started threading the next needle. And for a time they worked together in the old way, shoulder to shoulder, the way they had in the village on winter evenings when the candles were low and the world outside was cold. And this, just this, the warmth and the work and the presence of each other, had been enough. It was still enough. It was more than enough now. Caius found her there an hour later. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. Maren focused and serene with her needle, Lucy with thread in her hands, and the look on her face that she had stopped trying to conceal from him some weeks ago because he noticed it regardless. His gaze moved between them and settled, and something happened in his expression that had no name in any language Lucy knew, but that she recognized completely. He crossed the room and sat beside her, not saying anything, in the way of a man who had learned that some moments did not require language. After a while, he took the thread from her hands and turned it over slowly between his fingers, examining it the way he examined everything, with full attention, without hurry. "Your mother made your dress," he said. "The ivory one." 3 weeks, Lucy said. Every stitch. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set the thread down on the table between them, gently, and covered her hand with his. "Then she already knew," he said, "before any of the rest of us did." Lucy looked at her mother. Maren did not look up from her work, but the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly, just enough, in the expression of a woman who has been keeping a faith for a very long time and has finally, completely, been vindicated. Outside, the spring light came through the stone windows of the northern throne and lay across the workroom floor in long, warm bars, and the world was new enough that anything could still be true, and old enough that the best things already were.